Setting and assembly hall Sabah in Maithili, open-pillared, a lamp burning. Scholars of many schools have gathered, as was the custom, to test one proposition against all comers. Act 1. The first bouquet of flowers. Of arguments concerning the cause of the world. Scene 1. Invocation. Stage. Curtain rises on the lamplit Sabah. Udayana stands, folds his hands toward an unseen image, and speaks first not to the assembly but as an offering. Before argument, an offering. Understand these words in two senses at once, as one speaks of flowers, and, in the same breath, of doctrine. Udayana, as invocation, half chant, a beat, then more plainly, to the hall, definition of the subject of inquiry.
I mean, then, to make plain the nature of that Lord, that transcendent self, whose worship the learned call a road to heaven and to freedom.
Scene 2. Why inquire at all? The assembly stirs, a murmur of half-agreement.
Udayana, why inquire? The Veda already sings of him. Every tradition in this hall already has its god under a different name. What doubt remains to open an inquiry?
None, and that is exactly my point, friend, and exactly my problem. Look at this assembly. The follower of the Upanishads calls him pure consciousness. Kekiller / people called him eternal and conscious, but not the maker. Patanjali / yogins call him a self untouched by affliction, who wears a body only to teach. The Pashuporters call him free even of the rules that bind us. Shavers call him Shiver. Vaishnavas, Vishnu, the tellers of pure honor, call him grandsire of all. The ritualist calls him the one to whom the oblation is poured. The Digambar calls him one freed of body and of ignorance. The Mimamsarkar calls the deities of the mantras themselves God. Even you, Karvarkar, have some word for what ordinary people mean by /God.
A word, not a belief.
Even a word is data, friend. My point stands. Everyone in this hall already agrees that something is meant by /God/ and disagrees completely on what. That is not the ground for silence. That is the very ground that demands inquiry. We have heard enough from Scripture. It is time now to reason.
The Veda itself says, first hear, then reflect. And the elders add, through hearing, through reasoning, through the quiet practice of meditation, a soul comes at last to seal itself truly. So, reflection begins. Scene 3. 5 doubts named.
Let me be honest about what stands against me before I offer a single proof. 5 doubts, and I will take them one by one across this bouquet.
1. There is no unseen supernatural cause behind our fate in the next world at all. 2. Even without such a cause, plain human striving is enough to explain ritual and its fruits. 3. There is positive evidence that God does not exist. 4. Even if some proof of God is offered, that very proof will turn out invalid. 5. No authoritative proof of God exists at all, valid or not.
Good. Say them plainly. That is fair debate. Take the first, then.
Scene 4. Against / no unseen cause /.
Look at how differently people act. 2 men, same circumstance, choose opposite paths. One turns to ritual, one to indulgence, one to renunciation. That difference in tendency has causes, and the chain of those causes has no first link we can point to. And whatever a man reaps, he reaps in his own person, not another /s. So something unseen must connect this life /s action to a fruit received beyond it. This world, thick with every kind of suffering unequally dealt out, cannot be uncaused. An uncaused thing either exists always or never. It does not arise here, cease there, on no schedule at all. Yet plainly this world of ours does arise and cease on a schedule none of us set, therefore some cause beyond the seen.
Unless the effect simply arose by accident, no cause needed at all.
Scene 5. / by accident / examined and refuted.
Say what you mean by /accident / and I will show you it collapses into one of 4 things. No cause at all. Self-production, production from nothing, or merely a fact about the thing /s own nature. None of the 4 survives. Every effect that comes to be has a clear earlier limit, the moment before which it was not, and a clear later limit, the moment after which it will not be. As it is, nothing marks that limit at that moment except a cause acting then.
But suppose the moment itself needs no further explanation. A thing simply has the property of beginning to exist on this day rather than another, the way space simply has the property of being eternal.
A property shared by everything explains nothing about why this thing on this day. If backslash beginning to exist whenever it does backslash rejects each thing backslash s bare nature with no cause behind it, the very question backslash why then, and not really your backslash would return endlessly and answer nothing. No, production needs a producer. Chance is not an answer, it is the question wearing a disguise.
Scene 6 on cause, general and particular.
Then tell me why the same kind of cause, say fire, arises from such different means: dry grass rubbed, wood churned, sunlight gathered through a lens. If cause determines effect strictly, how does one effect come from three unlike origins?
Because causal power is known through observed correlation in each distinct context, not proclaimed once for all contexts at once. Grinding, churning, focusing, three different causal complexes, each independently verified to yield fire under its own conditions. Nothing in that variety damages the rule that an effect requires a sufficient cause. It only shows that backslash sufficient cause backslash can be realized more than one way. The rule survives. Only your picture of it was too narrow.
Assembly, a murmur of assent. Scene 7, unseen merit as the cause of the world /s diversity.
Granola. Why must the unseen merit and demerit, adresha, be the missing cause?
Why not simply say ordinary, visible, auxiliary causes strung together explain all the diversity we see?
Because if visible chains of causalum explained everything, no one would trouble to perform a single unrewarded ritual, and yet people do, expecting nothing here, only hereafter. Ask why they persist. Not for pleasure. The unbeliever seeks pleasure more directly and skips the ritual. Not for reputation alone. That fails to explain private devotion no one sees. Not because elders deceive the young, for the elders themselves keep the observance, and a deceiver does not usually deceive himself first. Some cunning founder inventing it all for his own gain, then he alone should have grown rich and free, giving nothing away, yet the pattern runs the other direction entirely. The sincere give away what they have. No exhaustive account without an unseen throat survives scrutiny. Something unseen, some adresture, must be admitted as the real cause connecting this act to that throat.
Scene 8, potency as an independent reality, causality of absence. Narrator reads the section title, Eudaeana, and the object to work through a longer technical passage, condensed here to its spine /.
Even so must this /potency you speak of be some separate reality over and above the visible substances that act. Could not mere absence of an obstruction be doing the causal work with nothing further needed?
Absence can remove a hindrance. It cannot, by itself, produce a positive effect. To make bricks into a house you need not only the absence of the builder /s laziness, but the mason /s hand. Ritual, likewise, does not merely clear a path. It lays down something, a residual potency in the agent, that ripens later into fruit. That residue is real, though unseen. Its reality is inferred, exactly as we infer fire from smoke, by its necessary connection with an effect that has no other adequate explanation. This is the same style of reasoning that will, in time, carry us all the way to God, and inference from effect to a cause required by the effect. Nothing mystical, nothing merely asserted.
Scene 9, whom does ritual consecrate? Exposition of Samkhya and its critique. The Samkhya teacher rises /.
Let me offer our school /s account. Since it touches your very question, we hold that Prakriti, primordial nature, unconscious but active, woven of the three gunas, undertakes all transformation of the world unaided for the sake of Pirasha /s liberation. No further cause, unseen merit or God, is required. Prakriti alone suffices as the ground of ritual /s power and the world /s unfolding.
An elegant system, teacher, and I will grant it much, but consider Prakriti, as you describe her, as one undifferentiated at the root, acting always by the same essential nature, a single uniform cause. Left to itself, cannot by itself explain a sequence of unlike effects arising one after another, each waiting its turn. As she produces successively, something must account for the order of that succession, and that something is exactly the kind of unseen, individuating cause I am arguing for. Grant me that much, and we are no longer very far apart. You have simply not yet given it the name I give it.
We will not settle that today, but I concede the difficulty is real.
Scene 10, the Carvaco is answered. The Carvarka steps forward, impatient. Backslash.
Enough delicacy. There is no unseen anything. What is not seen, touched, or reasoned from direct perception is simply not there to reason about. Ritual is habit. The next world is a story told to keep the poor obedient.
Then answer me plainly, Carvarka, why do sincere people perform rites that cost them, that bring them no worldly return, that they could abandon at no cost to their reputation, and still they persist, quietly, without display? Ye have called it habit, but habit needs a first cause, too, and every account you offer, pleasure, custom, deception, founder /s cunning, collapses the moment it is tested, as I have already shown this assembly. What is not directly seen is not thereby proven false. It is simply what must be established by inference, which is the very tool you yourself used to work from smoke to fire, though you have never seen the two joined at the source.
Inference I permit, faith I do not.
Then let us continue by inference alone. That is all I have asked of anyone in this hall.
Scene 11. The Border and the Doctrine of Momentariness. The Border steps forward. Backslash.
Videha, your whole argument leans on things that endure, an agent who ritually acts today and reaps tomorrow, a self that persists to receive the fruit. But nothing endures. Every existent is momentary, arising and perishing in the same instant it appears. What you call /, the same person / tomorrow, is only a causal series, each moment new.
Then tell me, on your own doctrine, who reaps what was sown by a moment that no longer exists at the time of reaping? If nothing endures even an instant longer than its arising, the doer of the deed and the receiver of the fruit are, by your own account, two different, unconnected momentary existence, and moral responsibility itself dissolves. Consider, too, how ordinary recognition works. I see a jar today and know it as the same jar I saw yesterday, not a new jar resembling the old. If that recognition of identity were always illusion, no cognition of difference between two moments could stand as reliable either, since both rest on the same faculty of comparing across time. Deny persistence, root, and branch, and you cannot even trust the doubt you have just raised against me, for even raising a doubt requires that the one who doubted a moment ago and the one who now speaks are the same continuing self.
We say the continuity is causal, not substantial.
And a causal series sufficiently unified to carry karmic fraud across time is, in every respect that matters here, what I mean by an enduring self. We may be closer in substance than in vocabulary, monk, but something persists. On that, this bouquet cannot yield.
Scene 12. Persistence and causality reconciled. Deal objection on the eternal self.
Grant persistence, then. Self, if an object / s very nature is to be a cause, must it not cause its effect always, everywhere, the moment it exists? The way blue is always blue. Yet an eternal, all-pervading self is not seen to produce pleasure and pain at every moment. How, then, can causality and an eternal self be reconciled at all?
Because causality is not / any object automatically produces any effect it is capable of. Always / it is the unobstructed antecedence of a cause relative to its effect, ascertained sometimes by watching agreement and difference, where that fails, as with something eternal and everywhere present, which cannot be absent anywhere to test the / difference / side, ascertained instead through a reason that establishes the causal relation directly. The self produces pleasure and pain only in conjunction with its proper auxiliary conditions, mind, body, the ripening of that same unseen potency we spoke of earlier. Not everything blue produces every blue thing / s affects at all times either. A particular cause, with its particular auxiliaries present, produces its particular effect. That is simply what causality means. Once stated carefully, and ordinary experience confirms it at every turn.
Concluding prayer. Scene 13. Concluding prayer of the first bouquet. Udayana turns again toward the unseen image. The hall quiets. /
That hidden power of the Supreme Lord which deals each soul its portion, call it Maya, since the mind cannot grasp it whole, call it Prakriti, since all creation springs from it, call it Avidya, since knowledge alone dissolves it. May that Lord, standing beyond the whole disordered churn of this creation, resting in perfect peace, wake devotion in my heart, stand as witness, visibly, to what I offer here.
Curtain begins to fall slowly on the sabbat, lamp still burning, as assembly murmurs, some persuaded, some still folding their arms. the debate visibly unfinished, waiting for the second bouquet. Act 2. The second bouquet of flowers, of arguments concerning valid cognition, the eternity of the Veda, and the possibility of a new creation. New voice joining this act, the Mimamsaka, a Vedic ritualist scholar, Curtis but unyielding, who holds that the Veda is authorless and eternal, and that cognition proves its own truth without external help. Scene 1. Why an omniscient being is still needed. Curtain rises again on the same sabah. Later in the debate, Udayana stands where he left off.
We have established, across the first bouquet, that an unseen destiny governs the fruit of every act, but destiny itself must have some cause, and no creature among us can perceive that cause directly. No one acts purposefully toward what lies wholly beyond cognition. So some extraordinary, omniscient being must exist, able to hand down to us true knowledge of that hidden causal link, so that we may act rightly at all.
Why reach for an omnipotent God? Udayana, when the beginningless and broken chain of Vedic tradition already carries that knowledge to us. Or, if you distrust an authorless Veda, the sage Kapila and others attain omniscience through yoga and discipline alone. Neither requires your God.
Because valid cognition depends on causes outside itself, and the world is not on any account unbroken. It dissolves periodically, entirely.
Scene 2. Is validity known from within or from outside? Before you reach for God, settle a smaller question first, one my school and yours have long disputed. When a cognition arises, is its truth known automatically, in the very arising of it? I say yes. To cognize something at all simply is to take it as true. What later proves false was, on inspection, never truly a cognition. Then explain doubt, Mimamsaka. If validity announced itself the instant a cognition arose, no cognition could ever be doubted, yet we doubt constantly. The moment a cognition goes and /t resemble others already confirmed true. Validity, like invalidity, is known by something external to the mere fact of cognizing. A further mark, a further inference, a test in successful action. But your /external test invites its own regress. If a second cognition is needed to certify the first, a third is needed to certify the second, and so on without end. Not so, because most of the time, certifying validity is simply unnecessary. Where there is neither doubt nor a reason for doubt, belief in an object arises, and we act on it without any separate act of certification. Only where doubt genuinely arises does the further inference come in, and there, it terminates, because the regress you fear threatens your intrinsic validity doctrine exactly as much as mine. You too must postulate that a cognition being known is itself validly postulated. Prove that, and you are inferring all over again. A fair hit. Consider the thirsty man who drinks the moment he sees water. You D say he directly perceives water S power to quench thirst, since he acts without hesitation. He does not. That power is inferred, instantly and unconsciously, from past experience, the way desire itself is born from a swift, silent inference that a certain action gets a certain result. Swiftness is not sameness. An extrinsic test, taken quickly, still remains extrinsic. Scene 3. Dream, waking, and more S2 hands.
Then tell me how any of us tells waking from dreaming at all, Udayana, if validity is never simply given. I dream I am drowning in a pond, the terror is total, indistinguishable in the moment from any waking terror, until I wake and find no water anywhere.
And the moment you wake, the two states stand in sharp, undeniable opposition, the dim memory of the dream against the vivid immediacy of waking. That contrast is itself the criterion. It does not need to be imported from anywhere else, because waking experience supplies its own standard against which the dream is measured and found wanting.
The Western logicians raise a sharper doubt still. A philosopher, Moore, they call him, held up both his hands before a hole and said, here is one hand, here is another, therefore external objects are real. His critics answered, if your very eyes could be doubted, showing us your hands proves nothing.
Let them doubt on. A mere logical possibility that evidence might someday surface against a fact is not the same as evidence that has surfaced. Push that skepticism to its root, and you land on the law of non-contradiction itself. Call it a tautology, if you like, empty of content, but even the skeptic must stand on it to say anything at all, including his doubt. I do not need certainty invulnerable to every conceivable future. I need what any reasonable inquiry needs, the balance of evidence, honestly weighed. And on that balance, Naya_S account of validity, known through marks external to bare cognition, confirmed finally by successful action, carries the greater weight. Illusion and error are undeniable facts of experience. If, as you Mimamsakas say, everything cognized is thereby true, what, then, are illusion and error? You have no answer for that.
Scene 4. Proves that sound is not eternal.
Grant me this much, then, and let me change ground. Even without your God, the Veda need not be authored at all. The Veda, and the very sound it is made of, may simply be eternal, requiring no faultless speaker and no author to answer for.
Then I must take that from you too, friend, and I will do it from plain hearing. We say, every day, that sound has stopped, the drum was struck, and now it is silent. That is a direct cognition of sound S destruction. Sound cannot have merely moved elsewhere, being formless. It cannot have been covered over, for covering belongs to things with shape. It has not merely grown too faint for us, for the same excuse would prove that a shattered pot has not really broken, only become invisible.
But the ear cannot perceive that absence directly. Its substratum, ether, cannot be perceived at all.
The ear need not perceive ether to perceive the absence of sound in the ear, precisely as darkness is perceived as the absence of light, without anyone perceiving the invisible particles that would be its locus. And listen to the sound itself. Pitch rises, falls, loudens, softens. One and the same eternal thing cannot bear opposed qualities at once. What you call the same word, recognized again is a flame recognized again, new fuel, new light, each moment, called by one name out of habit. Production and destruction, not eternity, is what your own ear tells you, if you will trust it.
The tradition will need to answer you on this at length, elsewhere.
It will. For now, it is enough that sound, and with it, the spoken Veda, is produced, and what is produced can be lost. Which returns us to the question, who restores it, each time the world dissolves and forgets? Scene 5. How can a new creation even begin?
Suppose I grant dissolution. During dissolution, on your own account, nothing moves, nothing acts, the sky itself stands empty and still. What, then, could possibly initiate a new creation out of absolute stillness?
Consider deep sleep first, as a smaller case of the same puzzle. In dreamless sleep the self_S cognition, desire, pleasure, and pain all fall silent together, yet the body_S breath continues, faint, and the self wakes again undamaged. So too at cosmic dissolution, an extremely subtle motion persists in the atoms of the four elements, too fine to register as the world until its final stage marks the moment and becomes the seed of new creation. It is not that a day must always be preceded by another day of its own kind. The first day of the monsoon is preceded by the last day of summer, not by another rainy day. So too the first day of a new creation is preceded by dissolution, not by another day of an old world.
And the first human beings, the first Brahmins, the first speakers of any tongue at all, no parent taught them to speak, for there was no one yet to teach.
As the first scorpion arises from rotten dung, not from a scorpion parent, and only later generations breed true, so the Supreme Lord may himself take the forms of teacher and pupil at the world _S dawn, gesture as a puppeteer moves a puppet _S hand toward a distant object, and in that gesture teach the very first convention of word and meaning. From that first instruction the whole chain, potter to potter, weaver to weaver, teacher to student, descends unbroken until the next dissolution breaks it again. Scene 6. The long decline, and why scripture needs restoring.
And do not imagine the chain is holding as firmly today as it once did. Look honestly at what has already frayed. Rites once performed with full memory of thousands of Vedic branches now survive, if at all, through a single branch, imperfectly kept. Dharma once stood on 4 legs: austerity, knowledge, sacrifice, charity. Austerity fell, 2 legs remained. Knowledge fell, 1 leg, charity bears the whole weight now, and even that leg is wounded.
Then say plainly what you are building toward.
That scripture is not self-sustaining. Its authority depends on the Veda, not on the general good conduct of virtuous people copying one another, for if virtuous conduct alone were sufficient to make an act obligatory, no scriptural injunction would be needed at all, and yet we all know rites that have lapsed entirely, with no living witness, that must one day be restored, not merely remembered. Restoration needs a knower, and faith in scripture merely recognizes truth. It cannot manufacture it once the original cause is gone. Scene 7. Kapila is tested, and found insufficient.
Then let Kapila serve as that knower, a sage of direct perception, purified by yoga, moved by compassion for suffering creatures, capable of reviving what scripture has lost.
Test that claim as carefully as you tested mine, friend. Meditation may indeed be a means of knowing what is otherwise hidden, I do not deny it wholesale, but meditation does not automatically yield knowledge the instant it is practiced. It needs some other means to confirm what it has found. What confirms Kapila /S meditation on compassion and non-violence, whose fruits no one has ever seen? A coward meditates fruitfully on a snake only because he has met a snake before. No one has met the fruit of yoga directly, in this life or between 2 lives, for the body that acts in this birth and the body that reaps the fruit in the next are not even the same body, and without some experienced link joining the 2, the connection cannot be verified at all.
It is said some remember former births.
It is said, but not established. A teacher who falls asleep on a holiday night and resumes yesterday /S lesson at dawn proves only that memory holds within 1 life, not across the gulf between 2. And consider the very first Brahmins, at creation /S dawn. By what memory could they have known their own lineage, if no one had yet been born to remember it? No power of travel between worlds is proven either, that might have carried settlers in bearing a caste system ready-made. It is, in the end, simpler and more reasonable to accept one omniscient, omnipotent being, who needs no body, no untested memory, no unproven journey between worlds, than to multiply unproven, half-omniscient sages to do the same work badly.
I will carry the question forward, Videha. I do not yet carry your conclusion.
That is exactly as debate should stand, at the end of its second round. Scene 8. Concluding prayer of the second bouquet. Udayana turns once more toward the unseen image. May my heart hold fast to Shiva until life /S last moment, he who, aided by the destinies of every being, builds this astonishing world again and again, and, like a magician undoing his own trick, unmakes it again, whose will runs unopposed through the whole of the cosmos, who is its final cause. On that Lord alone, let my devotion rest unmoved. Curtain falls slowly. The Mimamsaka remains seated in thought as the lamp dims. Assembly murmurs, the ground has shifted, though no one yet concedes. Act 3. The third bouquet of flowers. Of arguments refuting every alleged proof that God does not exist. The atheist, Gnostica, joins the floor this act, not a school so much as a stance. Whatever cannot be caught by some means of knowledge, he holds, cannot be real. The Karmaka, the Mimamsaka, and the Vaisheshika, a precise, categorical logician cousin to Naya, also speak. Scene 1, he is not seen, therefore he is not Curtain rises. The lamp is trimmed higher, this bouquet is the whole /S most contested. You have spent 2 bouquets building toward a maker of the world, Udayana. I will spend this one demolishing the foundation. If God existed, he ought to be knowable, as a cow /s horn is knowable by its shape and color. He is not known. Therefore he does not exist, exactly as a hare /s horn does not exist, precisely because, though its shape would be knowable if it were there, no one has ever perceived one.
A clean argument, and cleanly wrong at its first step. Your inference works only where the object was already granted to be perceptible. The hare /s horn fails the test of perception. It was always eligible to sit. God was never claimed by any theist in this hall to be an object of ordinary perception at all. You cannot fault an unseen thing for failing a test it was never entered into.
Then how is he known, if not by the one method you now exempt him from?
By inference, which is precisely what these 5 bouquets exist to supply. Save your strongest objection for the 5th, when the inferences themselves stand before you. For now I only clear the ground. Non-apprehension of a thing never claimed to be apprehensible proves nothing.
Scene 2. Sleep, the self, and what non-apprehension cannot touch. Consider your own self, then, as a test case. In dreamless sleep you do not apprehend your own self, yet you do not conclude, on waking, that you have ceased to exist. Why does the same silence, applied to God, not equally prove his absence?
Because in sleep the causes that would produce self-cognition are simply not assembled. The mind has withdrawn from the senses, not because the self has vanished, but because the instrument of noticing it has gone quiet. The very fact you rely on, that no one doubts their own continued existence through a dreamless night, is itself proof that non-apprehension does not entail non-existence. You have refuted your own method with your own example.
Then try this instead. A conscious being ought to show bodily activity, as the sprouting seed shows the garden of /s hand. No divine activity is seen before a single sprout appears. No activity, no agent.
A pot needs an embodied potter. The world does not thereby need an embodied maker of the identical kind. The self persists, unmoving, through sleep, through fainting, through the stillness of poison or extreme cold, without any bodily sign at all. Different effects proceed from different kinds of causes, and there is no law binding every maker to a visible hand.
Scene 3. The Karmaka /s wager, and why it cannot be cashed. The Karmaka steps in, sharper than before. /.
Let me strip this down further than the atheist does. I do not even require knowable but unknown as your loophole. My rule is simpler. What is not known, in any sense, does not exist. What is known, exists. God is never known. Finished.
Then finish it, Karmaka, and see where it leads you. On your rule, the moment you step outside your own house, you no longer perceive your wife, your children, your stored grain. By your own law, they must be judged destroyed the instant your eyes leave them. Do you believe that?
Memory assures me they remain.
Memory assures you of many destroyed things too. A childhood house long since fallen, a friend long dead. Memory alone cannot certify present existence. The instant you lean on memory to save your family from your own rule, you have conceded exactly what I need. Non-apprehension does not prove non-existence. And consider the eye itself, the very organ your seeing depends on is never itself seen, yet you do not doubt it exists. Your rule, followed honestly, destroys your own instrument of doubting.
Ordinary conduct does not need certainty. It runs on probability, general agreement, tested by use.
Then where does probability lie, on your account? If a thing is seen, you say its existence is certain. If unseen, its absence is certain. You have left no middle ground for probability to stand on at all. You have described a doctrine with no room for the very mode of belief you say it rests on. Scene 4. Why inference itself survives the doubt.
Grant inference some ground, then, if you insist. But how is doubt about it ever finally removed? Every observed pattern might break tomorrow, or a mile from here, or under some condition we haven't /t thought to check. That threat never closes.
It closes the moment you notice something you have already conceded. To doubt a future deviation, you must already be able to think about the future, and that very capacity is inference, extended from present time through hour, day, and season. You cannot use inference to attack inference without borrowing the very tool you are trying to disqualify. and practically, doubt ends, where a counterfactual would trap the doubter in his own contradiction. Deny that cause and effect are reliably connected, and the very act of doubting, itself an effect, could never have arisen in you at all. A reasonable mind does not chase every conceivable exception forever. It follows a reason whose pervasion has been tested and holds and acts.
Carry it forward, then. I will listen to the rest.
Scene 5. Comparison, and the fifth bouquet /S coming test, set aside.
One more avenue, Videha, before you move on. Some old comparison cognition through observed similarity, to be its own independent means of knowledge, distinct from perception and inference. If so, a difficulty for you follows. Everything known resembles something else already known, but the God you describe as nothing else similar to him anywhere. Could comparison then prove his absence, by that very singularity?
Only if similarity were some third kind of entity, neither being nor non-being, and no such third kind exists. Being and non-being exhaust the field, deny one, and you have thereby affirmed the other. Similarity is simply a property of things that already are sorted under one or the other of those two categories. It needs no independent status, and therefore yields no independent weapon against a being who happens, by his nature, to be singular. Uniqueness is not a defect that argument can weaponize. It is simply a fact some subjects have and others don't. /T.
Scene 6. Verbal testimony, and the dispute over an omniscient author.
Then let me press you on testimony itself, since this whole bouquet circles back to whether the Veda needs an author at all. The Visheshika treats an ordinary sentence /S meaning as something inferred from the speaker /S intention, testimony reduced to a kind of inference. My own school /S Prabhakara branch goes further. Only the Veda, being authorless, carries independent authority. An ordinary human sentence is trustworthy only once inference has certified the speaker reliable. Both positions ask testimony to do more work than it needs to. The moment you already know a word /S expressive power, the sentence /S meaning arrives with the hearing of it, no separate inferential step, no prior certification of the speaker /S reliability is required for comprehension to occur at all. A child, who does not yet know whether the Veda has an author, still understands a Vedic sentence perfectly well the moment he hears it. That alone shows understanding does not wait on settling authorship first. Testimony is its own means of knowledge, standing beside perception and inference, not smuggled inference wearing a disguise. Then consider the sharper objection some raise directly against you. If an omniscient creator composed even human language itself at the world /S dawn, teaching the first speakers word by word, how could such teaching ever get off the ground, with no shared word yet existing between teacher and pupil to teach with? As I have already shown you, in the second bouquet, through gesture before word, exactly as a puppeteer /S cord makes a puppet /S hand point at a distant thing, and the watching child infers meaning from the pointing before any word is spoken at all. Instruction need not presuppose language completed. It can begin language, gesture first, word following. I do not ask you to accept this today. I only ask you to notice that the objection, however sharp it sounds, has already been met.
Scene 7. Postulation and non-apprehension, briefly weighed and found insufficient. Narrator reads the remaining section titles together, briskly, as Videha answers each in turn. The pace quickens here, a flurry rather than a dual dot /. Examination of postulation as an independent means of knowledge. Examination of non-apprehension as an independent means of knowledge, and further examination of the same. One and then the other, Videha, since you have answered comparison and testimony. Postulation, first, the inference forced on us when a known fact makes no sense otherwise. Does postulation not, in some case, force us to explain the world without God, and so crowd him out?
Show me the fact that only makes sense without a maker, and I will answer it directly, but no one in this hall has yet produced one.
Every alleged case of postulation against God turns out, on inspection, to be an ordinary inference-wearing postulation S-name, and ordinary inference I have already answered at length. Then non-apprehension once more, in its fullest form, not merely I have not seen him which you answered in the first scene, but the deeper Mimamsa claim that non-apprehension is itself a distinct sense-born means of knowledge, and that its silence regarding God should count as positive evidence. Trace it carefully, and it collapses into perception after all. A normal, unimpaired sense produces the determinate cognition no pot here by apprehending the place where the pot would be, not by some free-floating faculty of noticing absences in general. And a faculty that is, at bottom, perception in another guise inherits exactly the limit perception already had. It can report the absence only of what it was ever fit to detect in the first place. God was never within that fitness. The silence proves nothing new. It only restates, for the third time this bouquet, the very first answer I gave you. Then I have exhausted perception, inference by non-apprehension, comparison, testimony, and postulation, and none of them has delivered me your absence. Not exhausted, friend, only tested, fairly, one at a time. That is all I have asked of anyone across this whole bouquet. Scene 8. Closing prayer of the third bouquet. Videha turns, one last time this act, toward the unseen image. With full devotion we bow to that God of gods, worshipped across every tradition in this hall under 100 names, whose quiet festival of bliss no rival joy equals, whose reality no perception can catch and discard, no inference overturn, no other means of knowledge unseat, and on whom, in the end, every one of those means of knowledge itself depends to be trustworthy at all. Curtain falls. The atheist remains standing a moment longer than the rest of the assembly before he, too, sits. Act 4. The fourth bouquet of flowers. Of arguments concerning God as knower, and the true nature of cognition. The shortest bouquet, and the most inward turning. Having secured that God exists, and cannot be disproved, the whole now asks what it even means to call an unmoving, all-knowing being a knower at all. The Mimamsaka carries most of the argument this act. Scene 1. Can omniscience even be valid cognition? Curtain rises on the same lamplit sabah, later still. Videha looks tired in the good way, a debater deep into his case, not worn down by it.
One more difficulty, Videha, and it strikes at the root of everything you have built. You call God omniscient. But valid cognition, by definition, must know something not already known, otherwise memory itself would count as a valid means of knowledge, which no one accepts. God S knowledge is total, nothing is ever new to him. If nothing is ever new to him, on your own definition, nothing he knows can count as valid knowledge at all. And if his knowledge is not valid, he is no trustworthy author of anything, including the Veda you have spent 3 bouquets defending. Then the flaw is in that definition, not in God. Knowing what was not known before cannot be what makes a cognition true. It is both too narrow and too wide. Too narrow. See the same jar twice, and the second seeing is every bit as true as the first, though nothing is new in it. Too wide. An illusion may present something never seen before and still be false. Novelty tracks neither truth nor falsehood. What makes a cognition true is simply this, that it corresponds to how the thing actually is. By that measure, God S cognition, being total and never in error, is as true as any cognition could be, whether or not any of it is new to him. Then how do you distinguish a second true seeing of the same jar from mere memory? We do not call memory a means of knowledge. Because memory depends entirely on a prior cognition to borrow its content from, it cannot arise from nothing. A fresh seeing of the same jar depends on the jar being presently there, seen again through its own causes, not recalled from a store. And God S case is simpler still than either.
His cognition of the whole universe is a single, self-identical act, dependent on no other cognition before it, needing no second glance at anything. Call it neither new nor old, it simply is, entire, all at once. Scene 2. The bid for knownness 3 attempts, 3 failures.
Let me try a different thought, then. Surely cognition does something to its object, leaves some mark on it. We call this mark knownness . The property an object gains, simply by being known, of having been known. Without it, being produced in your own inference for a divine maker becomes untrustworthy, because an agent who leaves no trace on what he touches can hardly be said to know his own materials.
3 ways to argue for such a mark, and none survive testing. First, that cognition, being an action, must yield a result the way any action yields a result, and that result is knownness. But an arrow shot at the empty sky produces no result in the sky. Cognition may be like that arrow. Real motion, no mark left behind. Second, that we say the part is known and this phrase itself proves some new property sits on the part. But we equally say the part was destroyed the part that no longer exists to receive any property at all. Language describing a relation to an act does not, by itself, prove a real residue in the object. Third, that the very fact we can talk about cognition proves some perceptible trace it leaves. But the causes that let us talk about a cognition are the very same causes that produced the cognition in the first place. Nothing further needs to be posited to explain the talk.
Then knownness explains nothing but cognition its own nature doesn't t already explain on its own.
Just so. A cognition of a part is a cognition of a part by its own nature, exactly as an effort to lift a stone is an effort concerning that stone by its own nature, without either one depositing some third thing into what it touches. Scene 3. Is cognition itself something we perceive?
Set the object aside, then, and turn the question on cognition itself. How do you even know a cognition has occurred, if not through some further cognition perceiving it, endlessly, one behind the next?
Not endlessly, directly. The moment an indeterminate awareness of some external thing arises, the very fact of being a cognition is already faintly present alongside it to the mind. On the next moment, when a further cognition of that same object arises, the mind turns and knows the earlier cognition determinately, the way a first fire recognized in one s own kitchen lets one recognize, by the same mark, a second fire glimpsed later on a distant hill through its smoke. Cognition is not itself perceived through some second, separate cognition standing outside it, the mind s direct relation to the self, in whom cognition inheres, is enough.
Then answer the harder form of the question. On your school s own account, a cognition lasts barely 2 or 3 moments before it perishes. If it is that brief, how does it last long enough both to reveal its object and to be caught, itself, by the mind looking back at it? And does that fleeting cognition, in its second moment, still grasp the very same object it grasped in the first, or has the object, in that instant, already changed?
The same object, held across both moments. Nothing stranger is required than granting that a cognition, once arisen, persists briefly enough to do both jobs without contradiction, to disclose its object, and to become, in turn, an object for the mind s next glance. Chase the alternative you regesturing toward, that each vanishing instant would need its own vanishing knownness to certify it, and that knownness its own further knownness to certify it, and you have simply reproduced, one level up, the same infinite regress you were trying to rescue knownness from in the first place. Simplicity favors dropping the extra entity, not multiplying it. Scene 4. What ner means for a being who does not act.
Grant everything so far. Still, every means of knowledge we have ever named is defined by doing something. The eye acts upon light, an inference acts through a middle term, a word acts through a speaker s utterance. God, on your account, does none of this, no sense contact, no middle term, no speech act producing his knowledge. By what right, then, do you still call him a knower at all, using a word built entirely out of agency?
Because ordinary etymology gives only the common root of a word /s meaning, not the whole of how it is actually used. We call a sense faculty a means of knowledge because it is causally involved in producing cognition. We call God a knower for a different, equally legitimate reason. Cognition simply resides in him, as a permanent feature of what he is, without needing to be produced by anything at all. A person can be a knower without, at this instant, being an agent of anything. Knowing does not require doing. Nor need I claim his cognition is some fifth, undiscovered means of knowledge alongside perception, inference, testimony, and the rest. Broaden perception to mean simply direct, uninterrupted awareness of an object, not perception through sense contact specifically, and God s knowing falls naturally under that wider sense, without forcing a new category into being. Scene 5. Does knowing every error make God s cognition erroneous?
One last thrust, and then I yield this bouquet. If God is omniscient, he knows every false belief every creature has ever held, every illusion, every mistaken inference, every dream. But then the objects of all our errors are, in some sense, present within his own cognition too. Does that not make his cognition itself shot through with error? And if his knowledge already contains our mistakes, what use is his teaching in dispelling them? You have confused the error with the knowledge of the error, friend, and that confusion is exactly the kind of mistake God s cognition, unlike ours, never makes. An illusion is false. But a true cognition that identifies an illusion as illusion, this is a false cognition is not itself false. It is precisely the opposite. Clarity about falsehood, not participation in it. God knows every error exactly as it actually is, as error, and a cognition that correctly sees error as error is, by the very definition we settled at the start of this bouquet, true. Far from undermining his teaching, that is the only thing that makes his teaching worth anything at all. He does not merely hold our mistakes alongside his own truths, he sees them as mistakes, which is precisely what we, still caught inside them, cannot yet do for ourselves. I have carried 4 bouquets of doubt into this hall, Videha, and you have met every one of them without once raising your voice. I do not yet call myself answered in full, but I no longer call myself your opponent either, only your most stubborn student. The debate has no better outcome than that, friend. Sit and rest a moment. What remains is not defense any longer. Scene 6. Turning toward the 5th bouquet. No concluding prayer is given for this bouquet in the source text. The surviving pages move directly from the discussion of God s knowledge of error into the great positive proofs. Narrator marks the turn, instead . 3 bouquets of defense are behind this hall now. The doubt that no unseen cause exists. The doubt that ritual needs no God. The claim that God can be disproved outright. And, in this 4th and shortest bouquet, the question of what it even means to call so still a being a no . Every doubt raised against him has been met and turned. One task remains, greater than all the rest, not merely to defend the citadel, but to build it. 8 proofs, standing on their own feet, requiring no opponent s first move at all. That is the 5th bouquet, and the summit of this whole garden. Curtain falls softly, no music of ending, only a pause, lamp trimmed brighter for what follows. Act 5. The 5th bouquet of flowers. The 8 proofs establishing God s existence. The summit of the debate. Udayana no longer merely answers, he builds, proof after proof, each one standing on its own feet. The atheist, the Karvaka, the Mimamsaka, the Samkhya teacher, the Border, and the Vaisheshika are all present in the hall, no longer opposing in turn, but listening as one assembly to a case finally being made in full. Scene 1. Framing the 8.
Curtain rises for the last time. The lamp burns steady. Videha stands at the center of the hall, and for once no one interrupts him at the start. / 4 bouquets, and I have done nothing yet but clear ground, answering doubt, refuting attack, defending the possibility of a maker. Tonight I stop defending. 8 proofs stand before you, each sufficient on its own, needing no opponent / s first move to exist at all. That the world is an effect, that the first motion in the atoms requires a mover, that the world is sustained, that it is destroyed, that the very conventions of word and craft required a first teacher, that the validity of the scriptural tradition demands a trustworthy source, that scripture itself testifies to its author, that even bare number, 2ness, 3ness, in things too small for any of us to count, bears the mark of a counting mind. Test each one as harshly as you have tested everything else I have said this evening. I ask only that you test them one at a time, on their own ground.
Begin, then. I have not conceded easily tonight, and I will not begin now.
Good. That is exactly how this should end.
Scene 2. The first proof. The world is an effect.
The earth, the mountains, the bodies we sit in, all of it is produced, exactly as a pot is produced. And nothing produced lacks a producer. Therefore, the world has a maker.
Then that maker has a body, as every potter does. And if he has a body, he is not the bodiless god you have been building toward for 4 bouquets.
Press that objection, and watch it fall through your own hands. Either you are claiming God has a body, in which case you have already granted he exists, and merely quibble about his shape, or you are claiming the world was not made by an embodied being, and conclude from that alone that it was not made at all, which contradicts the very inference you are supposedly answering. A general cause need not share every feature of the particular causes we happen to have seen before. Fire is inferred from smoke, regardless of which fuel burned. A maker is inferred from a made world, regardless of whether that maker wears a body. /embodied/ was never the load-bearing part of my proof. You have argued against a word I did not need.
Scene 3. The second proof. Motion in the atoms.
Consider the atoms themselves, then, before they ever became a /world at all. At creation /s first instant, atoms that had never before moved began to move, and combine. What is inert cannot move itself, a spade does not swing itself into the earth. Something conscious must impel it. Destiny alone might account for that first motion, without any conscious impeller at all.
Destiny is one cause among several needed, teacher, not a cause that crowds out all the others. An inert thing, precisely because it is inert, needs a locus of consciousness to set it moving, exactly as a spade needs a hand. You may call the specific motion of a living body different in kind from the first motion of an atom, if you like, but define bodily motion any way you choose, and you will find the definition already assumes exactly what I am arguing. A special motion, produced by a conscious agent. You cannot use the very thing under dispute to disqualify the inference that establishes it.
Scene 4. The third and fourth proofs. Sustaining and destruction.
The world, immense and heavy as it is, does not fall, as a bird /s great weight does not fall, sustained by its own effort in flight. Something sustains the whole of it, moment to moment, the way effort sustains a living body. And when that same world is later destroyed, down to the smallest indivisible pair of atoms, destruction, too, requires an agent capable of it, precisely as cloth is destroyed only by the tearing hand, not by nothing.
Destiny again might account for both, stability without a sustainer, dissolution without a destroyer.
Destiny is real, and I have never denied it, but a cause acknowledged is not every cause excluded. If destiny alone explained the body /s sustenance, effort itself would have no work left to do in keeping a living creature upright, which is plainly false, as any of us standing in this hall could tell you. Sustaining and destroying are, each one, effects. Effects need agents. The world /s vastness is no exemption from a rule that governs every smaller thing we have ever watched rise and fall. Scene 5. The fifth proof. Who taught the first word? Consider something closer to home than atoms, the very conventions by which any of us here understands the other. A potter /s craft is learned from another potter, a weaver /s from another weaver. A child learns the alphabet from a teacher who learned it from a teacher before. Trace that chain back far enough, and you reach a first link, a first potter with no potter to learn from, a first speaker with no language yet spoken to be taught in. Perhaps the chain simply has no first link, beginningless, like the round of rebirth itself. The cycle of creation and dissolution is beginningless, monk, I do not dispute that. But within any one cycle, at its own fresh dawn, there are no fallen or ordinary human beings yet available to have originated anything. Something must set the very first convention moving, in each new beginning, the way a puppeteer /s gesture, a cord pulled, a hand pointed, teaches a watching child the meaning of a word before any word has yet been spoken between them. That first teacher need not keep a body permanently. Scripture itself records a being who takes form again and again, precisely to renew what would otherwise be lost. Scene 6. The sixth and seventh proofs. A trustworthy tradition, and Scripture /s own word.
Then let me meet you on my own ground, one final time. You see the Vedic tradition /s validity itself proves a source behind it. But validity, on my school /s teaching, needs no external guarantee, it is simply what a properly caused cognition already is. And if every cognition /s validity needed a further cognition to certify it, we would face the same regress that has followed us since the second bouquet, a regress I answered then, and answer again now. A tradition this vast, this stable, held by learned people across every generation, is not the kind of thing a single limited person invents from nothing. It requires, at its root, one being of the requisite excellence to originate it truly. And Scripture does not merely imply such a source, it names one. In passage after passage, unprompted by any need for praise, the Veda speaks of itself as issuing from a knowing mouth. This Veda issues from me, in every cycle a new a collection of sentences accepted, on its own authority, by every knowledgeable person who has ever studied it, resting on nothing beyond itself, is not the same thing as an ordinary human composition, whose author merely goes unnamed. You have carried that thread across 4 bouquets to reach here. I recognize the shape of the argument, even if I have not yet fully laid down my own. That is honest, and it is enough for tonight.
Scene 7. An interlude. Who commands when Scripture commands?
One thread you have not yet pulled, Videha. Scripture does not merely describe, it commands. The self should be known. What is a command, if not simply an action, or a desire, already present in the listener without need of any speaker behind it?
Neither will serve. Not action, for know the self commands nothing that moves through space at all, and any command reduced to mere action collapses into every ordinary sentence describing a person walking to market. Not desire either, for the very desire to act arises only from cognizing the command /s meaning. Make desire the meaning of the command, and desire becomes both cause and effect of itself, circular and empty. What a command actually conveys is a speaker /s intention that the listener act, and an intention requires, by its very grammar, an intender. You should do this is meaningless without someone whose desire it expresses concerning you. Every injunction in Scripture, examined honestly down to its grammar, points back to a speaker standing behind the verb. Scene 8. The eighth proof. What counts the atoms?
And last, the strangest and, to my mind, the most delicate of the 8. A pair of atoms has a certain magnitude, a triad, a magnitude far greater, too great to be explained by atomic size alone, for if mere multiplication of atoms explained it, 2 atoms together should already show that same gross size, and they plainly do not.
Something beyond mere aggregation, a numbering, a counting, must operate even here, at a scale no eye in this hall could ever perceive directly. Two-ness is not a property lying passively in the pair, it arises through an act of enumeration, and atoms are, by their very nature, invisible to every one of us, whose enumeration, then, gives the dyad its two-ness, if no finite creature has ever counted a single atom in its life.
Only an omniscient counter.
Only an omniscient counter. 8 proofs, friend, the world has effect, the atom's \first motion, its sustaining, its destruction, the first teaching of every word we speak, the validity of an ancient trust, scripture \s own testimony to its source, and now number itself, present in what none of us could ever count alone. I do not claim any single one of these, standing by itself, could not be picked at by a patient enough opponent across another whole evening. You have shown me tonight exactly how patient this hall can be. I claim only that 8 independent lines, converging on the same conclusion from 8 different directions, no one of them borrowed from the others, are not 8 coincidences. That is what a bouquet is, in the end, not one unbreakable flower, but many gathered together, so that even if one petal bruises, the bouquet itself still stands whole in your hand.
Scene 9. Direct knowing, beyond argument.
And is there truly no way to know him except by chains of reasoning, Videha, 8 proofs, each requiring a hall like this one and an evening like this one to walk through? Reasoning is not the only door. Yogin's report direct inner knowing of him, the way a dream sometimes shows a mind things no external sense supplied it, not every dream is mere memory replayed, some carry the texture of genuine experience. Through discipline, through the stilling of ordinary restlessness, that same kind of unmediated knowing is said to be possible for God, as it is, in smaller measure, for the vividness of a true dream. I have not asked this hall to take that on faith tonight. I have only walked you, proof by proof, toward the point where faith and reason arrive at the same door from different roads.
Scene 10. Final prayer of the whole bouquet. Judeana turns, for the last time in this drama, toward the unseen image at the head of the hall. The whole assembly, objector, Mimamsaka, Karvaka, Samkhya, Border, Vaishishika, atheist, falls quiet around him.
If even this, 8 proofs, offered honestly, tested honestly, cannot move a mind, that mind is stone, and no bouquet of arguments will soften stone. So I do not pray for victory here. I pray instead, may this bouquet of reasoning perfume both nostrils equally, may it satisfy the theist, who came already believing, and, in its own time, reach even the atheist, who came to break it. And if it cannot do even that much, then let it rest simply as an offering, gathered honestly, kept fresh, laid without expectation at the feet of the Lord of Teachers, who alone knows whether the mind that hears it tonight will find its way home sooner, or only later, or by some other road than this hall \s entirely.
A long stillness. Then, one by one, unhurried, the assembly rises. The atheist is the last to stand. The proscenium curtain, crimson and gold, the same curtain that rose on the first bouquet, begins its final, slow descent over the lamplit \. 5 bouquets, 8 proofs, and 1 lamp that has not gone out all evening. The debate ends here. Whether it ends settled is, as it always is in this hall, left to the one who carries it out the door. End of Act 5. End of the play.